All right. We're back with part two of our ongoing conversation about the Mexican American War.
Hey, everybody.
Hello, everyone. Yes. Man, that was a good talk last time,
Yeah,
Tom. I don't know if you
hopefully everyone out there, which maybe just two of us, we don't know, but hopefully everyone out there is enjoying it or got something out of it, anyways.
for the thousands of people watching, I
Yes,
think they probably enjoyed it, right?
I'm sure.
I did have a couple things I was investigating. I'll wrap this up quickly, but after our last talk, I was talking a little bit about like how strong is the British Empire
Yeah,
at this time, and so there's just two things I kind of reminded myself of. One is now we're kind of getting into full swing industrial revolution, right? So they would have had a bit of a lead,
yeah, yeah,
in that category. Um, the British started their industrial revolution, I think, already in the 18th century. So they're pretty strong at this point, especially the Second British Empire. At this point, I was kind of like, well, how big are they getting? And certainly in India, they've expanded quite a bit. They don't control all of it, but by the 1840s, they've got a significant percentage of India. And then I was kind of reminded that in the Napoleonic Wars and the French Revolutionary Wars, they had gained a lot at the expense of the Dutch,
sure.
actually. So it's not so much like seizure of French colonies, but the Netherlands, being occupied by the French in that era and allied with them, they lost Guyana and the Cape Colony
Yeah,
and Ceylon all
sure.
all came into the British fold. And then you add like the start of Australia
Yeah.
in that era too. So by the time you get to the 1840s, that second British Empire is starting a little bit. So
Yeah, one interesting thing that was happening that I didn't mention last time was that the government of Texas, their first president, I guess you might call it, Sam Houston, actually was attempting to negotiate with the British
oh
for recognition, which is interesting because one of the we were talked about the slavery issue as being pretty paramount here, and Britain was claimed to be anti-slavery at the time. So this, if Texas became a state without slavery or a free country without slavery, that would be considered bad for the slave power in the South,
right.
and so and we already talked about the British sort of claims in the Oregon Territory and the kind of confrontation about that. So yeah, they're facing British intrigue on all sides, I guess, which somewhat increased popular support for annexation of Texas.
Yeah, it is interesting to think about. You go back to the War of 1812, and of course you have like the burning of the White House, right?
Yeah,
Just to think of like the United States in this position where you have like zero
yeah,
naval strength really relative to the other combatants.
yeah,
I
yeah,
mean,
yeah,
like the U.S. naval tradition, of course, goes back to like the Barbary pirates, and you had like the Constitution
yeah.
as like a heavy frigate effective in the War of 1812. But if you talk like in that era, the British having, I think, about 200 ships of the line, and the
Sure.
U.S. would have had zero. The rival state. I don't know by the time you get to the 1840s if
It,
much has changed, but I suspect not too much has changed in
I mean,
that.
America did have a navy. There's references in this to Navy admirals, and there was
Right.
some, they like transported the army to Mexico when we get to it. But
Yeah. If you think
yeah,
about like the Crimean War or
yes,
something, where it's like you're taking these ships of the line, with like 74 to 100 some
yeah,
cannon, and of course they're starting to convert them into steamships, but that'd be like so
yeah,
much naval power in relation to what we have. But then what we have dwarfed what
yeah,
Mexico had, nothing basically, apparently. So
yeah. Of course. Yeah, that's a big deal. The superior British naval power. One thing America has, of course, is that we're here and they're not. So they
exactly.
have Canada, but there's not many people in Canada at this time either. So
Right. When you're just trying to
the
impose your
question of
will. Yeah.
how much do you want to do here versus can you settle this and avoid war and conflict somewhere, that probably is something the British government of the time need to think about too,
Yeah.
under whatever king that was, or Queen Victoria at this time, right? And,
Yes. Right.
yeah,
Yeah. It's kind of early Victorian era.
early
So.
Victorian era. There we go.
So anyway, that was just kind of a something I thought was interesting from
For
last
fans
time.
of the British Empire out there, or opponents, whatever.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. So yeah, so today we can talk about whatever you want to talk about, but I think we're talking, kind of about the early stages of the Mexican-American War now, having fleshed out some of that historical context for the
Yes.
conflict. So, we could talk about many things. I think we talked about how Texas had become independent, and basically they had a lot of
Yeah.
Americans were
A
there,
lot of Americans were there,
so they wanted to join the United States.
and they were independent, but they're weak, and they need to ally with someone to survive, if not be annexed, whether that's Mexico or Britain or America.
Yeah.
They were probably going to get gobbled up by one of these entities if they didn't figure out an alternate plan.
And then what Polk is he campaigned on this, right?
Yes.
When with his presidency.
So the interesting thing is the president before that was John Tyler, who was not elected. He was the vice president under William Henry Harrison.
Okay.
And Harrison famously was elected president, and I believe caught a cold and died within a month of being elected. So we have current debates of the age of presidents, but of course we also have much better medical care than we did then. So yes, the first President Harrison, his grandson, also became president.
So Tyler did.
Yes.
Tyler was most of that presidency.
Tyler was most of the presidency
for that 4-year period.
And it was controversial because this had never happened before. Like, should the vice president take the presidency? That's what it says in the Constitution. But as we know, what the Constitution says and what we end up doing are often different things. So there was a lot of controversy. And Tyler was allied with the Whig Party, but he was a slave owner from Virginia and very pro-slavery. And the Whig Party was increasingly anti-slavery, and there were other issues, but that was the main one. He quickly was alienated from his party. And,
okay.
Basically, I think within a few months, and yeah, that became an issue where he's basically a man without a party, but he did have a base of support, and his big deal was the annexation of Texas, I think, more than anything else. He got a cabinet that was more all about that. He took various actions.
This is Tyler?
Yes, Tyler reached out. And eventually, there was an agreement to annex Texas. And then...
but he didn't quite get it done, though, he didn't, right? In his presidency, wasn't it like Polk kind of...
Polk was the final person. I mean, some of this stuff happened like right at the end of the Tyler presidency, which, and it's pretty confusing, and we're probably not going to get all of this right because we're wading through it. But right. The one interesting thing is that in those days, the elections were held in November of the fourth year, as they are. So the election was held in November 1844, but the next president wasn't inaugurated until March 1845. This continued until the 30s when we passed a constitutional amendment on the subject. But there's a lot of time there. So once the annexation of Texas was a thing done by the president, it then had to be ratified by Congress. I believe it was a treaty. So that had to be ratified by, or maybe not a treaty, but was some kind of resolution. I guess not treaty because it had to be passed by the House and the Senate.
Right.
I think so. So they passed it, and this was actually rejected by the Congress first in 1844.
Okay.
And then we had an election where Polk won on the pro-Texas platform, and I would say it's fair to say that positions on both sides regarding the slavery issue got more hardened than they were previously. And sort of a compromise position was less viable. But in any case, this made whatever happened in that election made this easier to pass. So this was passed at the end of the Tyler administration, and then it was basically handed off to President Polk, unlike his first day. And President Polk was all for this, so he elected to go with the agreement as it was. And of course, the effect of this was Mexico considered a declaration of war. So
Right. Right. So, right. Mexico, of course, did not want to see Texas incorporated into the United States.
Yes. And of course, there were dispute about the border, what the border was, whether it was the Nueces River, I believe it's pronounced, could be wrong, which was to the north of the Rio Grande. I
Right.
believe that's like Corpus Christi now, and might go up to the Austin, San Antonio area. I'm not sure, but anyways, it starts at Corpus Christi.
Right. So you
So
had
kind of that area, and then
yeah.
another claim that it was at the Rio Grande, which is south of there.
Right. So you had this end of that Texas War of Independence where they're successful at defeating the Mexicans under Santa Anna, I think. And right, so the treaty does not evidently clearly delineate between Mexican territory and Texan territory,
and just the America being that close to them, Mexico considered a provocation anyway. So there is going to be some kind of conflict, probably.
Yeah. So then it's interesting, right? Because Texas kind of says, "Hey, we need your protection, America, with our ill-defined border."
Yeah.
Right. So you have basically the U.S. Army projected to what Texas would assert is U.S. territory at that point. Right. It's like we're here to defend now American territory, but that is not agreed upon with Mexico. Mexico does not see that territory as Texan, now American territory. They see that as still being Mexican territory there in South Texas.
So definitely the Army started assembling down there, the American Army as it was.
Right. So it's what? Now we're talking Zach Taylor.
Yes, he was the general in charge of what was going on down there, the highest. He wasn't the highest ranking general in the Army. That would be General Scott, I believe.
Yes.
But
that's Winfield Scott, right?
But yes, but General Scott had political differences with the Polk administration. So, and the political differences in the Army were a lot more pronounced than they are now, I think, in terms of affecting what's going on there. It's a lot more professional now, but back then it was a lot of people with political ambitions and that kind of thing.
Right, you've got a lot more commingling of like military leadership or military aspiration and political aspiration are more intertwined.
Generals who wanted to be politicians and politicians who wanted to be generals, I think that was going there. So they put Taylor in charge. And the Army started assembling down there in Texas.
And Zach Taylor would have been, someone with some military experience. I think having served under Andrew Jackson, some in the War of 1812. So, it's kind of interesting. Some of these guys have experience in prior conflicts like the War of 1812. Certainly, Winfield Scott served in the War of 1812 under Andrew Jackson. And then a lot of them fought like in different wars with Native Americans, like you have the Black Hawk War of 1832, the Seminole War of 1837. There's these different kind of, I'll call them lower intensity conflicts, leading up to the 1840s.
And we were starting to get a professional army, like we had West Point, and we had, training, and we had career soldiers, and certainly Taylor had been in the military his whole career, I believe. And so you had some, of course, you had to raise up more soldiers that were available in a lot of states, sent their militias, what might be the equivalent of the National Guard today, but a lot of states were sending troops as well.
It's interesting, right? You've got a small professional army
Yeah,
that has stuck around for a while, and they're mostly fighting Native Americans. Then you have the tradition of state militias that go way back, of
yeah,
course, into the earliest colonial days, where it's kind of a for defense only
yeah.
concept of those state militias.
Of course, mentioned in our Constitution in the Second Amendment.
Right, right.
And yeah, so you had all these groups assembling.
And then let's see, you've got pretty early on, you have uh, some conflicts start to
Sure,
break out there on the border, right? So you have basically Mexican and American forces trying to exert the territorial claims. And I know like the first casualty of the Mexican American War ends up being this Colonel Truman Cross, who had been, I think, like considered this founder of um, flying artillery. No, actually, that's somebody else. Sorry, my mistake. No, Colonel Truman Cross is the first casualty. He had served in the War of 1812. And yeah, so I think he's like kind of seen as being murdered to some
sure.
extent by, American forces in the area. So there's kind of almost like this climate of like vigilantism or seeking revenge
Yeah,
for Truman Cross having been killed. So it's
certainly.
kind
If
of it's
you
kind of different. It's kind of
if you need
desperado-ish.
something to rile up the troops, this will work.
Right, right. It's just it has this feel of almost like a western,
Yeah, yeah,
where it's not like it doesn't sound like regiments maneuvering. It sounds a little bit early on there like these groups of militia or groups of volunteers, um almost kind of like a western movie, trying to impose some kind of will in those early stages. But
sure. A lot of this, you have to remember that these are in places where weren't very well settled, and
right.
especially in the beginning, I'd say where the a lot of the inhabitants were recent. So yeah,
Yeah, and then I know what Polk is given authorization to raise 50,000 volunteers
yeah.
early on.
So this happens, and do you want to get into our first battle, or do you think that would be?
Yeah, I certainly can. Yeah, it's very interesting here early on. Yeah, because right, you have militias as considered defensive forces only.
Yeah,
You have Taylor's force originally assembled is about 3,500 men in 307 wagons. Those are regulars now. Those are
sure.
regular army troops that were deployed down on the border. But right, that eventually leads to the first conflict, which is the Battle of Palo Alto. And
This is pretty close to the border, right? Like close
yes,
to modern day, maybe Brownsville, Texas.
that sounds right.
Yeah.
Right, right. These conflicts are close to the Gulf of
Yes.
Mexico. They're not far inland. But yeah, so now we get to Sam Ringgold, who I was talking about before, where he's
Yeah.
he's killed at Palo Alto, and he's considered that kind of founder of the flying artillery. So this is evidently very mobile artillery that can be kind of quickly um, separated from the horses that
Sure.
deploy it into position, and then rapidly kind of remounted and redeployed as far forward as possible. So that flying artillery evidently is a pretty big advantage in these battles,
Yeah.
really throughout the war. As far as I can tell, it seems that it's interesting because the casualty ratios in these battles are pretty skewed. Palo Alto, you have like 4 Americans killed and 42 wounded, and there's
Yeah.
around 500 Mexican casualties. So if you figure anytime you're talking about like 10 times as many casualties on one side versus another, you got to ask yourself, how the heck do you explain that kind of disparity?
You would think someone has a technological advantage.
Yeah. Well, right. And at that point, it's so skewed that it's almost like there's probably multiple things happening.
Yeah.
It's technological advantage. It's probably tactical
Yeah.
discipline. Um, there could be aspects of just leadership and, kind of offensive aggressiveness that start to make a difference. So I know they talked a little bit in the book. Again, our book that our main references is So Far from God by John Eisenhower. But they talk about the Mexicans not having explosive shells. So there's a little bit of an ordnance difference there. But overall, yeah, it's like it seems that the Americans are dominating in terms of the use of artillery, even
Yeah,
though there's not a ton of artillery,
yeah, yeah.
as far as I can tell. It's like a limited number of actual artillery pieces. But yeah, the Mexicans make some use of lancers, which is always interesting.
Yeah,
You'll see like a lot of references to lancers in the book, which is kind of, you know, I would say something coming almost out of like Napoleonic tactics, that you see a lot of lancers integrated as one type or one style of cavalry.
sure. The Napoleonic Wars are like only 25 or 30 years before this, right?
Right.
Maybe less.
Yeah, you would have like all 19th century
Yeah, yeah,
tacticians looking, to the Napoleonic Wars and to Napoleon's victories, or maybe even Wellington's victories, for a lot of, inspiration in terms
sure.
of tactically what should you do. But right, they talk about the Lancers being defeated pretty decisively by the use of square. That would be like your Waterloo style
Yeah, yeah.
tactics, and the use of artillery. Um, so anyway, yeah, I mean, it's kind of a decisive American victory right from the onset. So that's Palo Alto, and then the following day you have this Battle of Resaca de la Palma, and that battle is it's something that was done like it was like the Mexicans deployed themselves in like a dry riverbed kind of area that had like a lot of brush.
Yeah,
So it sounds like they were trying to negate maybe some of those artillery, like far
sure.
ranged weaponry advantages of the Americans. But that didn't make too much of a difference. I know that is still a battle where it was more hand to hand fighting, but it's still an American victory, and the Mexicans are forced back after that. And right, these are near Brownsville.
Yeah, so decisive early victories for America
In a
would be your
nutshell,
thing. Yeah,
yes, yes. There's kind of an interesting, somewhat political thing here too. I'll mention, which is you had this Brigadier General Gaines, who I think was, yeah, he had fought in the War of 1812,
yeah,
and he was kind of, I guess, a rival of
sure.
Winfield Scott. And so he's like living in New Orleans at the time, and he puts out this big call for volunteers. And evidently he didn't really like have like legal authority to
Yeah,
do that from the United States government. So he like assembles all these guys, he ships them down to like the Rio Grande, and Taylor has to like turn some of them back because like they don't have logistical
yeah.
capability to even sustain these volunteers. So it's just kind of a strange episode, and then there's like this question around their status, and
Well, the whole thing with political status at that time, and just like the communication issues that we keep talking about, that it's hard for us to imagine that it would take months for something to get back to Washington as far as what's going on. Like obviously the president and the cabinet and Congress and all these people are very interested in these things, but they're not there, so they have to wait to see what's happening. And yeah, this guy can just be operating New Orleans and raise this supposed army and then get down there and yeah, everybody's like, "What are you doing?" And yeah, there's a lot of that stuff going on and a lot of political intrigue, and all the generals have political rivals, and many of the generals and the lesser officers were want to be your actual politicians, and that's all going on during this, and it's all interesting, I think.
yeah, it's kind of fascinating how like I don't know, this is sort of this volunteer
Yeah,
tradition,
yeah,
I suppose, going back to even the Revolutionary War, where like some of these guys sign up for like 6 months,
yeah,
and so then they'll take like 3 months getting them moved down to the area where you'd want to make use of them. And then it's like, okay, now we're going to push on, further into Mexico, but now there's not enough time because, your commitment, your volunteer duration is up.
Of
So
course,
we gotta.
that has been an issue in the Army since then.
It is.
Your
It
one
is.
week in a month might not be that. Yeah.
For sure, yeah. No, I'm reminded a little bit of. I remember actually being in Afghanistan with somebody where they were kind of at the end of their contract commitments,
Yeah,
and it was like mid deployment, right? So it was like maybe 6 months into being there
sure.
for a year, and you would think like you're in theory the U.S. government has projected that person there for this year. That's
Yeah,
like the intent, but actually per the contract that person was on, they were entitled to leave,
yeah,
and at least the policy and position at that point was like, hey, we want you to sign this to
yeah,
voluntarily,
yeah,
like you voluntarily choose to extend. And this person was like, no. And they actually they sent them home.
yeah.
Like they only did half of the tour that they were expected to do.
And you do see that in this war at some point, a lot of soldiers do go home, and
Right.
that's always a factor that you can't really keep people there who don't want to be there for too long.
And a lot of them would be
Yes,
farmers, I'm sure
yeah,
too, where
farmers or
it's like the crops have got to be tended, or I've got to be back for a certain harvest.
oh
I'm
yeah,
sure
that
it
was a
was.
thing in the Army for years, at least till Vietnam, that you could get out of your 3 year stint that you were drafted for to go back and help your dad with the harvest. That was certainly a thing.
Right.
So yeah,
Well, let's see. Just had a couple other notes here. There was like a Texas Mounted Volunteer Regiment that became the Texas Rangers. That's kind of some of the early tradition of, I guess, that organization.
Texas Rangers continuing to be a main law enforcement agency in Texas, and of course, famous TV show Mr. Walker. So
Yes, yes, they're right. There was a leader named Walker,
yeah,
evidently, and right there's Walker's Texas
probably
Rangers.
where Chuck Norris got his idea.
I think so. I think so. Um, yeah, going back for a second to that why is it so skewed fighting on one side versus the other? I mean, like you alluded to, West Point has been organized
Yeah,
at that point, so I suppose that maybe some of the training that the U.S. Army Officer Corps had at that point was pretty telling, in terms
sure.
of the tactical outcomes here. So maybe you combine some of that training with, or the professionalism of that with the artillery advantage. And then there's definitely issues throughout this conflict. You can see it already here early, with sort of the unity of command on the
Yeah,
Mexican side. Their ability to stay organized, to project force, to have a unified plan of attack. It looks like it keeps getting adjusted as different players come into the mix. Different leaders with different levels of clout.
yeah. I mean, America has its issues, but certainly on the Mexican side, I would say it appears there are even worse issues in terms of who's in charge and does the general have political support to do what they want to do at any given time. That seems to have been a constant issue.
Right. Well, yeah. So that's kind of the first couple battles, I
Yeah,
guess,
yeah.
anyway, of the conflict, and probably stop this episode here. And yeah, we'll just kind of keep going in chronological order
Yes,
here, I
we'll
think.
kind of muddle our way through it as we've been doing, and yeah, this will appear whenever we have time to do it, I guess.
That's right. That's
And
right.
yeah, hopefully you guys are enjoying this. I mean, we're enjoying it, which is the main point of us doing it. So
Yeah.
yeah, we will see you next time, I guess.
Yeah. If you have any comments or questions, leave them in the comment section on the YouTube channel. It's a great way to reach us. So thanks.